My stepdaughter looked me dead in the eye and said the best wedding gift I could give her was to stay home. She told me I wasn't her real father. To her, I was just Robert, the guy who signed the checks. My wife sat right next to her and didn't say a word, not a single defense. So I gave them exactly what they asked for. I vanished. But before I left, I made sure to take everything that belonged to me. By the time I sold the roof over their heads and canceled every single wedding contract, the only thing left in that empty kitchen was a folding chair and a receipt for $0. It was the absolute shock of their lives. Before I tell you how I completely dismantled their world in 72 hours, hit that subscribe button if you believe loyalty is earned and betrayal always comes with a price. My name is Robert Sullivan. I'm 68 years old, and for the last 15 years, I've been the silent engine funding a luxury lifestyle for people who secretly resented me. I've spent my life looking at financial statements, calculating risk as a Fortune 500 CFO. I know a bad investment when I see one. I just never realized the worst investment of my life was sleeping in the master bedroom while living on the margins like a guest in a hallway room. Last Friday night was supposed to be a celebration. We were at Le Bernardin, one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan. The lights were low, the tablecloths were crisp, and the air was thick with old money and quiet judgment. I sat across from my wife, Patricia, and her 26-year-old daughter, Madison. Madison was glowing, wearing that specific influencer look that comes from weekly facials and a total lack of hard work. She was scrolling through her phone, probably checking the engagement on her latest post about wedding planning stress. I sat there, sipping my sparkling water, waiting. The waiter placed the bill on the table in a heavy leather holder. Without looking up, Madison slid a cream-colored envelope across the table toward me. It was the formal wedding invitation. The paper was thick, hand-pressed cotton with gold foil lettering. I knew the texture well because I had paid $5,000 for the printing alone. I opened it, expecting to see my name listed as the host. Traditionally, the father of the bride, or in this case, the stepfather who financed everything, gets top billing. I scanned the elegant script. Mr. and Mrs. Gary Miller request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Madison. I froze. Gary Miller, her biological father, the man who hadn't paid a dime in child support since 1998. The guy who showed up once a year with a hangover and a cheap toy, then vanished whenever the rent was due. My name was completely missing. I looked up at Madison. She wasn't looking at me. She was dissecting a scallop with her butter knife. Madison, I said, keeping my voice low, I think there's a misprint here. My name is left off. She finally looked up. Her eyes were the exact same shade of blue as her mother's, and they carried the same capacity for cruelty. It's not a mistake, Robert. We talked about it. Gary is walking me down the aisle. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I set the invitation down. But Gary isn't hosting this wedding, Madison. I am. I've already put down $80,000 in deposits. The venue, the flowers, the catering. Gary hasn't paid for anything. Madison let out a sigh, the dramatic kind she reserved for when a waiter brought tap water instead of bottled. Please, Robert, don't make this about money. You always make everything about money. This is about aesthetics. Gary is my biological dad. He has this rugged, artistic look that fits the vintage vineyard vibe we want. You have to admit, you're a bit too corporate. You look stiff in photos. We want this to look perfect for Vogue. I looked at Patricia, my wife of 15 years, the woman I took on Mediterranean cruises, the woman whose debts I cleared when we got married. Surely she would speak up. Surely she would say, Madison, that is incredibly disrespectful to the man who paid for your braces and put you through NYU. I waited. Patricia took a sip of her Chardonnay. She dabbed her lips with a napkin, avoiding my eyes. Honey, she said softly, directing it at me, not Madison, it's her big day. We just want her to be happy. Gary is family. You know how sensitive he is about his status. We don't want him to feel excluded. Excluded. The word hung in the air. The man who abandoned them was family. The man who paid the mortgage was an accessory that didn't match the wedding decor. I looked down at the leather bill folder, an $800 dinner, just to be told I wasn't photogenic enough to be a father. I didn't shout. I didn't flip the table. Years in corporate boardrooms taught me that the moment you get emotional, you lose your leverage. I pulled out my American Express Centurion card. The heavy metal clicked sharply against the porcelain plate. I understand, I said. I want the photos to be flawless, too. Madison clapped her hands. Thank you, Robert. I knew you'd understand. Oh, since you're being so reasonable, Tyler and I were thinking about upgrading the toast to Dom Perignon. It's only an extra 4,000. I looked at her smile. I saw the straight teeth I paid to fix. I saw the dermatology treatments I covered. I saw 15 years of entitlement that I had nurtured. Order whatever you like, I said. The drive back to Connecticut was dead silent. The interior of my Mercedes was perfectly insulated, sealing us in with the tension. I drove. I always drove. Patricia sat in the passenger seat, scrolling on her iPad. Madison was in the back, texting her fiancé, Tyler. I watched the city lights fade into the darkness of the highway. My mind was racing, but my face remained stone cold. I was doing math, not wedding budget math, but the math of my life. I calculated how many years I had delayed retirement to support their lifestyle. I calculated how much of my portfolio I had liquidated to buy the house in Greenwich, just because Patricia said she needed to be near her friends. Patricia cleared her throat. In the quiet car, it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Robert, she said, her voice dripping with that false sweetness she used whenever she wanted something. I was thinking, since Gary is walking Madison down the aisle, he needs to look the part. He doesn't own a decent suit. My eyes stayed on the road. So, she continued, hesitating for a second before pushing through, you have that beautiful charcoal Armani suit in your closet, the one you wore to the gala last year. You and Gary are about the same size now, and he's lost a little weight. I was wondering if we could just borrow it for him for the weekend. We don't want him looking shabby standing next to Madison. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They didn't just want to replace me. They wanted to dismantle me for parts. They wanted the deadbeat father to wear my clothes so he could play the role of the successful parent. It was almost comical. It was absurd. I took a breath, slow and deep. If I snapped now, they would make me the villain. They would say I was jealous, petty, and controlling. I needed to be smarter. I needed to become the ghost they already thought I was. Sure, I said, my voice sounding flat even to my own ears. He can borrow the suit. Really? Patricia sounded surprised. Oh, thank you, honey. That's so incredibly generous of you. I know this is awkward, but it means the world to Madison. From the back seat, Madison chirped, Thanks, Robert. You're a lifesaver. Gary is going to look amazing in it. Amazing. She was talking about her father. I felt a wave of nausea. I turned on the radio to drown them out, settling on a classical station, letting the violins fill the space. I needed to think. I needed a plan. The wedding was in 3 weeks. The final payments for the venue and catering were due in 5 days. That was my window. I had 5 days to tear down 15 years of illusions. We pulled into the driveway of the colonial home I bought 3 years ago. It was a massive estate with white pillars and manicured lawns, a place that cost more to maintain annually than most people make in a year. The porch light was on, looking like the picture-perfect American dream. Inside, though, it was just an empty shell. I carried the bags in. Madison went straight to her room to FaceTime Tyler. Patricia went to the kitchen to pour another glass of wine. I told them I had some work to finish in my study. I walked down the hall toward my office. The house was filled with things I had paid for. The Persian rug in the foyer, the abstract painting Madison insisted was an investment, the grand piano nobody played. I felt like a stranger wandering through a museum of my own exploitation. I stepped into my study and shut the door. It was the only room in the house that felt like mine. It was lined with mahogany bookshelves, smelling of old paper and leather. I sat at the heavy oak desk. I didn't turn on the computer. I just sat in the dark for a moment, listening. I could hear Patricia's voice drifting from the kitchen. She must have thought I couldn't hear, or maybe she just didn't care anymore. She was on the phone. He actually agreed to the suit. Patricia was laughing, that high-pitched, brittle laugh that sounded like breaking glass. I know, right? I thought he'd fight it. But he's so desperate to be liked, he just folded. There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. I knew instantly who it was. Gary. Yeah, well, he's useful for now, Patricia continued. We just need to keep things smooth until the honeymoon is taken care of. Madison wants the Maldives. That's another 20,000. Once the wedding is over, we can talk about the house. I think I can convince him to downsize to a condo so we can cash out some equity. You can get that truck you wanted. My blood went completely cold. This wasn't just about a wedding. This was a long-term plan. They were planning to drain me dry and discard the shell. I heard Gary's voice through the speaker, faint and tinny. The old fool. Is he suspicious about the prenuptial terms? No, Patricia scoffed. He thinks he's smart with his finance degree, but he's a soft touch when it comes to family. He thinks he's the protector. It's pathetic, really. He's just an old ATM that needs a little grease every now and then. An old ATM. That was the line. That was the moment that severed any remaining shred of sentimentality I had for these people. The anger that had been simmering in my stomach crystallized into something cold and analytical. I stood up and walked over to the oil painting behind my desk. I slid it aside to reveal the wall safe. I turned the dial. Left to 32, right to 15, left to 8. The heavy steel door clicked open. Inside were stacks of documents, passports, and backup drives. I reached in and pulled out a blue folder from the very bottom. The label read, Premarital Assets and Property Planning. I laid it out on the desk, turning on the green banker's lamp. The light flooded the paperwork. I opened the folder. Right on top was the deed to the house. My finger traced the legal description. Purchaser and sole owner, Robert Sullivan. Because of Patricia's credit issues from her first marriage with Gary, her name had never been put on the deed. We had a prenuptial agreement that explicitly stated any assets purchased with funds from my pre-retirement accounts remained my exclusive property. I looked at the next document, a revocable living trust. It controlled access to the accounts Patricia used for daily expenses. I looked at the contracts for the wedding vendors. Every single one of them was signed by me, not Madison, not Tyler, me. I wasn't just the ATM. I owned the bank, and the bank was about to close. I checked the time. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Friday. Most people would wait until Monday to call a lawyer, but I am not most people. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice. Sullivan, a gravelly voice answered. It was late, but Arthur Blackwood never slept. He was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to leave nothing but scorched earth behind. Arthur, I said, apologies for the hour. You're the only client who apologizes, Arthur grunted. What's wrong? You sound like you're looking at a body. Not yet, I said, looking at a framed photo of Patricia and me on the desk. I flipped it face down. But I need to liquidate a property immediately. I need a cash buyer. 7 days to close. Which property? Arthur asked. The house I'm standing in, I said. There was silence on the line. Then Arthur let out a dry, raspy chuckle. The Greenwich estate? Patricia isn't going to like that. Patricia won't know, I said. Not until the locks are changed. And Arthur, I need to stop some checks. A lot of them. I heard the sound of a lighter flicking and a deep inhale. Start talking, Robert. I've got a pen. For the next hour, I laid out the blueprint for their total financial eviction. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply moved assets from column A to column B. I instructed Arthur to trigger the cancellation clauses in the wedding contracts. I authorized the immediate sale of the house to a holding company that specialized in quick turnarounds for distressed assets. If they could take possession in 48 hours, they could have it for 20% under market value. I told him to take the deal. I didn't care about the loss. I would have set the house on fire if it weren't illegal. Losing money was acceptable. Losing my dignity was not. When I hung up, the house was perfectly quiet. Substantial dreams of Armani suits and Maldivian beaches were filling the heads of Patricia and Madison upstairs. They had no idea the roof over their heads had just been sold. They had no idea the credit cards in their purses were now dead plastic. I walked to the window and looked out at the pool, shimmering blue in the moonlight. I remembered teaching Madison how to swim in that pool when she was 10. I remembered holding her when she cried over her first heartbreak. I remembered paying off Gary's debts so he wouldn't go to jail, just so Madison wouldn't have a felon for a father. I had been a good man. I'd been a generous man. But tonight, Robert the father was gone. Robert the CFO was back in charge, and the upcoming audit was going to be brutal. I went back to the safe and pulled out one final item. It was a velvet box containing a diamond necklace I had bought for Madison as a wedding gift. It had cost $15,000. I looked at it for a moment, the diamonds catching the light of the lamp. Then I dropped it into the trash can next to my desk. I turned off the light and walked out of the study. I climbed the stairs back to the master bedroom. Patricia was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even. I lay down on my side of the bed, the side I paid for. I stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow the real performance would begin. I was going to play the compliant, beaten-down stepfather for exactly 48 more hours. I would smile. I would nod. I would let them think they had won. I would let their balloon of arrogance expand until it was ready to burst. And then I would personally deliver the needle. As I closed my eyes, I thought about that invitation one more time. Mr. and Mrs. Gary Miller, I whispered into the darkness. Good luck with the bills, Gary. That was the end of Chapter 1. The fuse had been lit. The real fallout was just getting started. If you want to see how they tried to claw their way back, and how I used the law and the absolute truth to shut them down, keep listening. You definitely don't want to miss how this ends. The next morning, the sun broke through the windows of the breakfast nook with a bright, aggressive cheerfulness that only seems to happen when your life is completely shifting. Madison was already at the table, buried in a mountain of bridal magazines, aggressively circling floral arrangements with a red pen. Patricia was making a smoothie. The blender roared, drowning out any chance of conversation. Good morning, Robert, Patricia shouted over the noise. She poured a thick green sludge into a glass and set it in front of me. Drink up. You looked exhausted last night. We have a huge day ahead of us. Florist at 10, and then we need to get to the tailor to fit Gary. I looked at the smoothie, kale and ginger. It tasted like penance. I took a small sip. Actually, I said, setting the glass down, I was thinking we should expand the budget for the flowers. Madison's head snapped up. Her eyes went wide. Seriously? I nodded, keeping my face completely neutral. I was thinking about what you said last night, Madison, about the aesthetics. If Gary is walking you down the aisle, we need that path to look spectacular. Maybe those imported orchids you liked. The ones from Thailand. Madison actually shrieked. Oh my God, Robert, those are like 3 times the price. So what? I said, casually spreading cream cheese on a bagel. You only get married once. We need it to be Vogue-worthy. Patricia beamed at me. She walked over and kissed the top of my head. See? I told you he'd come around. He just needed a good night's sleep. I smiled. It was a tight, thin smile, but they were far too consumed by their own greed to notice. Call the florist, I said. Tell them to double the order and put it on my account. I watched Madison scramble for her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She was texting Tyler, no doubt letting him know the old ATM was spitting out cash again. While she was distracted, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Arthur Blackwood. Purchase agreement finalized. Funds wired by buyer. Escrow closes Monday morning. You have 48 hours to clear the property. I felt a rush of adrenaline. It was done. The clock was officially ticking. That day, we spent money like water. At the florist, I approved a $20,000 floral arch. At the tailor, I paid a rush fee to make sure my Italian wool Armani suit could be altered to fit Gary's beer gut. I stood in the fitting room, watching the tailor pin my suit fabric to this man. The same man who, 20 years ago, had destroyed my early family life while I was away working. Gary posed in front of the mirror. Not bad, Bob, he said, looking at my reflection. You've got decent taste. Shoulders are a little tight, but I can make it work. I'm sure you will, I said. He turned to me, lowering his voice. Hey, about the bachelor party. Tyler and I were thinking Vegas, just a quick weekend. Might need a little influx of capital, you know, if we're going to do it right. I looked at him. The man had no shame. He was a bottomless pit of entitlement. Send me the itinerary, I said. I'll take care of it. Gary clapped me on the back. You're a good sport, Bob. I don't care what Patty says about you being a stiff. You're all right. In my head, I added the Vegas trip to the list of things I would be canceling first thing Monday morning. The weekend blurred together in a frenzy of luxury spending. I became the ultimate yes man they always wanted. I approved the premium open bar. I approved a 12-piece jazz band instead of a DJ. I approved a vintage Rolls-Royce for the getaway car. But here was the catch. For every contract, I made sure Madison or Tyler signed the paperwork. Every single deposit was charged to their credit cards or funded through the emergency savings account Tyler's parents had set aside for their down payment on a house. In 48 hours, they accumulated an estimated $65,000 in pending personal liabilities. Sunday night, we gathered in the living room. The mood was celebratory. Madison was riding a high from the spending spree. Patricia looked smug. Gary was there too, sipping my scotch, stretched out in my leather armchair. To the happy couple. Gary raised his glass in a toast. To me for making such beautiful babies, Patricia giggled. And to Robert, she added as an afterthought, for being so supportive. I raised my glass of water. To Monday, I said. They thought I was toasting the day I would wire the funds. They had no idea I was toasting the day their entire reality would catch up with them. Late that night, I went to my study to ensure the timeline was perfect. The house sale would finalize at 9 a.m. The movers were scheduled for 10 a.m. My flight to Italy was at 2 p.m. I sat at the desk, looking at a stack of receipts Madison had proudly handed me, so I would know exactly how much to write the checks for. I pulled out my checkbook. I uncapped my pen. The ink was black, permanent. I wrote the date, Monday. I wrote the payee, Madison Miller. I looked at the amount box, and then I stopped. I looked at the check. It was a beautiful piece of paper that represented security and support. I ripped it out of the book. I tore it in half. Then I tore it again, and again, until it was nothing but confetti. I dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. There would be no checks, no wires, no rescue. I walked to the window and looked at the driveway. Tyler's car was parked next to Madison's. They were staying over tonight to be close to the bank in the morning. They were sleeping in a house that no longer belonged to them, spending money that didn't exist, building a future on a foundation of sand with the tide coming in fast. I went upstairs to the guest room. I had quietly moved my personal items there during the day. My suitcases were packed and hidden in the closet. My passport was in my jacket pocket. I lay down on the twin bed. It was uncomfortable, but it felt better than the king-size bed in the master bedroom. That bed was built on 15 years of deception. This bed was honest. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the house. It was the calm before the storm. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a completely different reality. I fell asleep, dreaming of lobster shells and withered orchids. When I woke up, the digital clock read 5 a.m. It was Monday. I got up, showered, and changed into my travel clothes. I moved through the house like a ghost. I could hear Gary snoring on the living room sofa, passed out from the night before. I walked into the kitchen. The granite countertops were cold. This would be the stage for the final act. I pulled the envelope from my jacket. Inside was a letter from me, the new owner's notice to vacate, and the cancellation receipts for the few vendor contracts that were actually in my name. I placed the envelope dead center on the kitchen island. I pulled a single folding chair over and set it directly opposite the envelope. It looked like an art installation, a monument to consequences. I checked my watch. 5:30 a.m. The movers responsible for the heavy furniture, the things I was selling off rather than keeping, would arrive in 4 hours. But by then, I'd be long gone. I grabbed my suitcases and walked toward the back door. I paused to look at the family photos on the wall. Madison's graduation, Patricia and me in Hawaii, Gary holding a beer at a barbecue. I took them all down. I didn't want them. I stacked them face down on the floor. I opened the door and stepped into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and orange. I got into my car, started the engine, and took one last look at the house. "Goodbye," I whispered. I shifted into drive and pulled away. The balloon was fully inflated, floating high and beautiful, and I had just let go of the string. While Madison and Tyler were busy maxing out their credit limits on lobsters and imported orchids, I had been sitting in a booth at a 24-hour diner 3 towns over. The cracked vinyl seats and the smell of burnt coffee were a stark contrast to the luxury I had just left behind. But this is where business happens when you don't want to be seen. Sitting across from me was a man in a sharp suit who looked like a shark. His name was Mr. Kane, a representative for a private equity firm that specialized in distressed assets. They bought properties for cash, asked zero questions, and closed immediately for the right price. Between us on the table lay a thick stack of documents: the deed to the Greenwich estate, an appraisal from last year valuing the property at $2.8 million, and the contract Mr. Kane had just slid toward me. I put on my reading glasses and looked at the number on the bottom line: $2.1 million. It was a lowball offer that would make any real estate agent scream. I was losing $700,000 in equity instantly, a 25% haircut. In my past life as a CFO, if someone had brought me a deal this bad, I would have fired them on the spot. But today, I wasn't looking for profit. I was looking for speed. I was buying a swift exit, and that always comes with a premium. I looked at Mr. Kane. He was watching me, tapping a gold pen against his chin, expecting me to counter. He thought I was desperate. He thought I was drowning in debt. He had no idea I was just a man who was done waiting. "The price is acceptable," I said, my voice steady. Kane stopped tapping. He blinked, clearly surprised. "Just like that? You know the market is hot, Mr. Sullivan. If you list this traditionally, you could get much more." "I don't have time for open houses," I replied. "And I don't have time for inspections or mortgage contingencies. I need the funds wired to my offshore account by tomorrow morning, and I need the title transferred immediately. However, there is one condition." Kane leaned in. "There's always a condition. What is it?" "Cracked foundation, mold." "The house is structurally perfect," I said. "I replaced the slate roof last year. The condition is simple. I need a lease back for exactly 7 days. I will pay the week's rent. But on the 8th morning at exactly 9 a.m., your company takes possession. You change the locks. If necessary, you bring a removal team." Kane smiled, showing a predatory amount of teeth. "We can do that. We are very used to handling sensitive exits. But what about the other occupants? Public records show you're married. Does your wife know you're selling the roof over her head for 70 cents on the dollar?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the document that formed the cornerstone of my entire plan. It wasn't the deed. It was something much more personal, a post-nuptial agreement signed 5 years ago. I pushed it across the table. "My wife has no claim to the property," I said. This was the secret weapon Patricia had conveniently forgotten about. 5 years ago, my wife had a secret of her own. She had developed a severe gambling problem. It started with bingo, moved to slots, and ended with high-stakes games in Atlantic City. By the time I found out, a man with a broken nose showed up at my office demanding $150,000 for markers Patricia had signed against her jewelry. She was terrified. She wept on our living room floor, begging me to save her, swearing she would never do it again. I saved her. I paid the debt. I made the problem go away. But I am a businessman. I do not advance capital without collateral. I told her I would clear her slate, but she had to sign a postnuptial agreement. It stated explicitly that in exchange for my financial rescue, she waived all rights to any of my premarital assets, specifically the Greenwich estate and my retirement accounts. She signed it without reading it. She was so desperate to escape the immediate consequences of her actions that she would have signed anything. She likely assumed I would never enforce it. She probably thought I was too soft, too in love, too weak to ever hold a cold contract over the woman sleeping next to me. She was wrong. Mr. Kane flipped through the legal document, reading the waiver clauses. He let out a low whistle, thoroughly impressed. "Airclad," he said. "You really tied her hands?" "I didn't tie her hands," I said, taking the document back. "I just refused to be the one who drowned with her." I picked up the pen. The ink flowed smoothly onto the paper. Robert Sullivan. I signed my name 3 times. With each signature, I felt the weight of that house lift off my shoulders. The heated pool, the home theater I never used, the wine cellar Gary was currently raiding. All gone. It was just brick and mortar now. I stood up and shook Kane's hand. His palm was sweaty. "Wire the funds," I said. "Have your people ready Monday morning. I'll leave the keys in the lockbox." By the time I drove back to the house, it was late afternoon. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, making the white pillars look like the bars of a golden cage. I pulled into the driveway and saw Patricia standing by the front door. She was holding fabric swatches against the exterior brick. She waved at me, smiling. She looked happy, safe, and secure. "Robert," she called out as I got out of the car, "I was thinking since we're doing so much for the wedding, maybe we should have the exterior repainted next month. This white is looking a bit dull. I want a soft cream color. It would look so elegant." I walked up the steps, looking at the house that now belonged to a private equity firm. I looked at the woman planning renovations on a property she was being evicted from in a matter of days. "Cream sounds nice," I said. She took my arm. "Madison also said we should eventually turn your study into a nursery, for when she and Tyler decide to have kids. You don't really use it much anyway, do you? You could move your desk to the basement." The basement. They wanted to relegate me to the basement of a house I had just sold. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. I opened the front door for her. "After you," I said. We walked into the foyer, and of course Gary was there. He was napping on the silk sofa, his feet propped up on the coffee table, wearing my slippers. He cracked one eye open as we walked in. "Hey, Bob," he grunted. "We're out of ice. Be a pal and run down to the store for a bag, will ya?" I looked at him. I looked at the ring of moisture his glass was leaving on the antique wood table. A normal man would have snapped. A normal man would have thrown him out. But I was in the end game now. Every insult was just fuel. Every slight was just validation for the decision I had made in that diner. "Sure thing, Gary," I said. "I'll get the ice." I walked into the kitchen, but I didn't go for the ice. I went to the calendar on the refrigerator. Patricia had marked the wedding date with red heart stickers. I pulled a black marker from the drawer. On the Monday after the wedding, I drew a small, inconspicuous X. "What's that?" Madison asked, walking in with a glass of wine. "Something happening on Monday?" I capped the marker. "Just a deadline," I said. "A business deadline. Nothing for you to worry about." She rolled her eyes. "You're always working, Robert. You need to learn to enjoy life, like Gary. He knows how to relax." I smiled at my stepdaughter, the girl whose tuition I paid, the girl whose car insurance I covered, the girl who was about to learn the harshest lesson of her life. "You're right, Madison," I said softly. "I'm going to start learning how to relax very soon." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to their wine and their illusions. I had 7 days left in that house. 7 days to pack my life into boxes while they planned a party. 7 days to watch them smile as they walked right up to the edge of the cliff. I went upstairs to my study, the room they wanted to turn into a nursery, and shut the door. I sat in my chair and listened to the quiet. It wasn't the silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence of a countdown. The ticking of the clock was clear and loud. Tick, tick, house sold, trap set. Now I just had to wait for it to snap shut. The clock on my study wall ticked past 4 p.m. The sun was beginning to slant through the blinds, cutting the room into sharp strips of light and shadow. I sat in the leather chair, the one I bought after my first major promotion 20 years ago, and simply waited. The house was quiet, but it was a deceptive quiet. It was the dead air before a trigger pulled. On the desk in front of me lay the charcoal Armani suit, freshly dry cleaned and encased in plastic. It looked almost like a garment bag for a ghost. I heard the front door open without a knock. It was Gary. He never knocked anymore. From the moment Madison declared him the father of the bride on Friday, he walked into my home like he held the deed. I heard his heavy footsteps on the hardwood, the scrape of cheap rubber soles dragging across expensive oak. He was whistling a tune I didn't recognize, something incredibly smug. "Hey, Bob," he called out, his voice echoing down the hallway. "You in your dungeon?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the door. A moment later, Gary appeared in the frame, looking as disheveled as ever. His thinning hair was slicked back in a desperate attempt to cover his scalp, and his face carried that permanent flush of someone who drinks alcohol for breakfast. He was wearing jeans that were too tight and a faded t-shirt that said "Legend" across the chest. The irony was almost unbearable. "There he is," Gary grinned, stepping into the room and looking around. "Man, I love this room. Smells like money. Old books and serious business. You know, when you guys go on your trips and I stay here for a few weeks, I think I'm going to make this my command center. Maybe put a little fridge over by the window. He pointed to the exact spot where my limited edition globe stood. I said nothing. I just pointed to the suit on the desk. It's ready for you, Gary, I said. He walked over, his hand running along the plastic cover. Nice, he whistled. Italian wool. The best? I said. He ripped the plastic open with a rough jerk that made me wince internally. He yanked the jacket off the hanger and held it up, sliding his arms into the sleeves. To my dismay, it fit. We were roughly the same height, though his weight was in his stomach while mine was in my chest. He buttoned it, the middle button straining slightly as he sucked in his gut until the fabric went taut. He turned to the mirror in the corner, posing and adjusting the lapels, looking at himself like he was the CEO of the world. Damn, he murmured. I clean up good. Look at this, Bob. You put a suit like this on a jagged rock, and it makes it look smooth, right? You look presentable, I said. Madison will be pleased. Gary turned to face me, leaning back against my desk. He crossed his arms, stretching the fabric of my suit tight across his back. You know, Bob, his tone shifted from vanity to something sharper, more venomous. I gotta hand it to you. You're taking this whole thing better than I thought you would. I met his eyes. I'm a pragmatist, Gary. Madison wants her father. Who am I to stand in the way of biology? Gary laughed, a wet, raspy hack. Biology? Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? You can buy them houses, you can buy them cars, you can pay for expensive degrees. But at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. You're just the resource, Bob. I'm the source. He picked up a crystal paperweight from my desk, tossing it casually into the air, watching the glass spin. Patty and I were talking last night, he continued, eyes locked on the glass. She's worried about you. Thinks you're getting too old for a house this big. All these stairs, the maintenance. It's a lot for a man in his twilight years. I remained perfectly still. Is that so? Yeah, Gary said. We were thinking maybe after the wedding, it's time for a change. Sell this place. Buy you a nice, comfortable little condo down in Florida with cash. One of those places with a nurse on call. Then, well, the rest of the equity could really help Madison and Tyler get started. And it's time Patty enjoyed herself, don't you think? She spent 15 years taking care of you. Taking care of me? The woman who hadn't cooked a meal in a decade? The woman whose gambling debts I had quietly dissolved? That's quite a plan, I said evenly. Gary smirked, setting the paperweight down. Look, Bob, don't make it difficult. You had your run. You got to play the family man. But now the real man is back. I'm going to be around a lot. Holidays, birthdays, Sundays. It's going to get uncomfortable for you. We're just trying to give you a dignified exit. He was evicting me. In my own study, wearing my own suit, the man who abandoned his daughter was telling me it was time to leave so he could feast on the wreckage of my life. I stood up and walked toward him. For a fraction of a second, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He remembered that before I was an accountant, I had been a Marine. He remembered that I knew how to break things. But I didn't raise a fist. I reached out and smoothed the lapel of his jacket. You're right, Gary, I said softly. I've been thinking the exact same thing. It is time for a change. I reached into my pocket. Here, I said. You'll need a pocket square to complete the look. I pulled out a folded white silk handkerchief, but tucked inside the folds, hidden deep within the fabric, was a device no larger than a piece of gum. It was a high-fidelity digital audio recorder, the kind I used to use for corporate board meetings. It was already running. The battery life lasted 48 hours, and the memory was deep enough to record a week of conversation. I slipped the handkerchief into the breast pocket of the suit, giving it a gentle pat. Perfect, I said. Gary looked down at the pocket. Thanks, Bob. You really are a servant at heart, aren't you? Always catering to better men. He laughed again, turning back to the mirror. I'm going to wear it out, he said. Get used to it. Me and Tyler are meeting for drinks. Got a lot to celebrate. Go ahead, I said. Have a wonderful evening. Gary strutted out the door, stopping with his hand on the frame. Hey, Bob. Yes? Don't wait up, he sneered. I waited until I heard the front door close. I waited until I heard the coughing engine of his rusted pickup truck start up and fade down the driveway. I walked to the window, watching the dust settle. He was wired. He was walking into a bar to meet Tyler, another opportunist. Alcohol would loosen their tongues. Arrogance would make them talk even more. Tucked inside that pocket, right against his chest, was the evidence I needed to unravel all of them. He would brag about the plan. He would laugh about how they manipulated me. He would admit to the coercion, and a judge would hear every word. I turned back to the desk. The plastic wrap from the suit remained, crumpled like a shed snakeskin. I picked it up and tossed it in the trash. I didn't feel angry anymore. The time for anger had passed. Now I felt only the cold, hard clarity of execution. I looked at the empty hangar, swaying slightly in the breeze from the air conditioner. "Wear it in good health, Gary," I whispered to the empty room, "because it's going to be the last suit you ever wear as a free man." I sat down and opened my laptop. I had one final transfer to make. I logged into the trust account, the one I had set up for Madison's future children. There was a balance of $200,000. I clicked on the tab marked Beneficiaries. I highlighted Madison's name. I hit backspace. The name disappeared. I typed in a new name, the Wounded Warrior Project. I clicked Confirm. The screen flashed green. Transaction successful. I closed the laptop. The sun had completely set now. The room was dark, but for the first time in 15 years, I saw everything with perfect clarity. Tomorrow was Monday. The movers were coming. The locks were changing. And in some bar downtown, Gary was recording his own undoing. The game was on. Tuesday morning arrived with that deceptive sunshine that usually precedes a major storm. The house was filled with a frantic energy that had nothing to do with joy and everything to do with vanity. Madison was pacing the kitchen, complaining about dark circles under her eyes, claiming the stress of the wedding was ruining her complexion. Patricia followed close behind, nodding sympathetically, casting glances at me as if I were the source of their exhaustion. This was the moment, the final dose of anesthesia before the operation. I pulled 2 envelopes from my jacket pocket. They were made of heavy cardstock, the kind that radiates luxury before you even open them. I placed them on the marble island, right next to Madison's untouched green juice. "I think you both need a break," I said, keeping my voice warm and concerned. "You've worked so hard to make this wedding perfect. I booked you 2 nights at the Sanctuary Spa in the Berkshires. The full package, massages, facials, mud baths. You leave in an hour." Madison froze, her eyes going wide. She tore the envelope open. The Sanctuary. "Robert, this place is impossible to book. It's over $2,000 a night." I smiled. I pulled some strings. "You need to glow for those photos on Saturday. Go. Relax. Don't worry about the house. Don't worry about the vendors. I'll take care of everything here." Patricia looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. Real tears this time. She walked around the counter and threw her arms around me, the scent of her expensive perfume filling my senses. "You are the best husband," she whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You're about to find out," I thought. "Go pack," I said gently, stepping back. "The car will be here at 10. For the next hour, I watched them scramble. They packed like they were going to Fashion Week, stuffing silk robes and designer swimwear into Louis Vuitton duffels. They were giddy, laughing, completely detached from reality. At exactly 10 a.m., a black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the driveway. The driver loaded their bags. Madison blew me a kiss from the back seat. "Bye, Robert. You're the best." It was the first time in 10 years she had called me the best, without immediately asking for money. It would also be the last. I waved until the car turned the corner, disappearing past the hedges. The moment the taillights vanished, the smile fell from my face like a heavy curtain. I turned back to the house. It was dead silent. It was 10:05 a.m. I pulled out my phone and dialed Titan Logistics. "You're clear to move in," I said. They must have been waiting just around the block, because 3 minutes later, 2 massive 18-wheeler moving trucks pulled into the driveway. These weren't ordinary movers. They were relocation specialists who provided white glove service, the kind used by museums and billionaires. Their uniforms were cleaner than Gary's best shirt. The foreman, a man named Miller, walked up to me with a tablet in his hand. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, "we have the inventory list. We'll prioritize the high-value assets and personal property. Exactly, I said. I want to be very specific. If I bought it, take it. If she bought it, or if it's cheap particle board furniture, leave it. I want the contrast to be stark and undeniable. Miller nodded. We'll have the first floor cleared out in under 3 hours. I stood in the foyer, directing traffic like a traffic controller at a surgical extraction. I watched them wrap the grand piano in protective padding. That piano had cost me $60,000. Patricia didn't even know how to play. She just used it as a massive shelf to display framed photos of herself. Take it, I said. They moved to the living room. The Persian rugs were rolled up, exposing the bare, unpolished hardwood underneath. The Eames lounge chair, my favorite reading spot, was wheeled out. The 75-inch OLED TV was unmounted from the wall, leaving behind nothing but a perfectly defined rectangle of dust. I walked into the kitchen. This was the hardest part, but the most necessary. I opened the wine cellar. Inside were 300 bottles of vintage wine. Bordeaux, Napa Cabernets, rare scotches. Gary had already made a dent in the collection, but the vast majority of the value was still there. Pack it all, I ordered. Just leave those 2 bottles of cheap grocery store Chardonnay on the bottom shelf. Why? One of the movers asked, genuinely confused. So they have something to drink when they realize their lifestyle is officially over, I said. By 2 p.m., the house had undergone a complete transformation. It didn't look like a home anymore. It looked like a warehouse undergoing a bankruptcy liquidation. In the dining room, the solid mahogany table that could seat 12 was gone. In its place, I had left the folding card table Patricia had brought into the marriage 15 years ago. It stood wobbly and scratched in the dead center of the grand room, looking pathetic. In the living room, the Italian leather sofas were already in the trucks. All that remained were a few velvet floor cushions Madison had bought from an online discount outlet and a beanbag chair that smelled like a dog. I went upstairs to the master bedroom. I had the bed dismantled, the Egyptian cotton sheets, the down comforter, the memory foam mattress, all mine, all funded by the sweat of a 40-year career. I told the movers to take the mattress. I left the box, spring. It felt petty, but then I remembered the conversation about relegating me to the basement. Pettiness is just a matter of perspective. I walked into the walk-in closet. My side was completely bare. I looked at Patricia's side, rows of designer dresses, shoes, handbags, tens of thousands of dollars in merchandise. I didn't touch a single thread. Let her keep her costumes. She'd need them to maintain the illusion of who she used to be while standing in line at the unemployment office. The artwork was the last to go. The hallways had been lined with original oil paintings, coastal landscapes I'd collected over decades. As the movers took them down, the walls looked naked. The hooks remained, protruding from the drywall like tiny metal accusations. By 6 p.m., the trucks were full. The foreman handed me the tablet to sign. "We're heading to the storage facility in New Jersey," he said. "Everything is accounted for, Mr. Sullivan." I looked around the foyer. The echo was deafening. The sound of my footsteps clicked against the floorboards. The house felt cold, stripped of the insulation of wealth. It was just a shell of a building now, a series of rooms connected by drywall and pipes. I walked into the kitchen one last time. It was the only room with light, as I had instructed the utility company to cut power to the rest of the house the next day. I placed the envelope on the counter, the one containing the eviction notice and the cancellation receipts. I pulled over the thin metal folding chair I had found in the garage. I set it directly opposite the envelope. I sat down for a moment. I closed my eyes. I tried to feel guilt. I tried to feel sadness for the woman I used to love. But all I could see was the text on her phone, mocking my intelligence to Gary. All I could hear was Madison telling me I was just Robert. I stood up. I wasn't Robert the husband anymore. I wasn't Robert the stepfather. I was a ghost. I walked out the back door, locking it behind me. I went to the front door and entered the code into the lockbox one last time. I dropped the heavy brass keys inside. It made a metallic clang that sounded exactly like a judge's gavel striking a sound block. Case closed. I got into my car. The sun was setting, casting long, dying shadows across the lawn. I didn't look back at the empty windows. I shifted into drive and headed toward the airport. I had a one-way ticket to Tuscany in my pocket. They had 2 more days of massages and cucumber water to enjoy. 2 more days of absolute bliss before they returned to the vacuum they had created. By the time the Lincoln Navigator pulled back into the driveway of the Greenwich estate, I was already 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, sitting in a quiet cabin sipping a glass of warm whiskey. I could picture the scene in my mind with perfect clarity, not because I was there, but because I had spent 15 years studying the habits of these two women. I knew exactly how the tragedy would unfold, beat by beat, scream by scream. It was Wednesday afternoon. Patricia and Madison stepped out of the car, their skin glowing from 2 days of exfoliation and seaweed wraps that cost more than my first car. They were laughing. Madison was likely looking at her phone, expecting a final confirmation from the florist about the orchid arches. Patricia was probably instructing the driver to bring the bags into the foyer, intending to tip him with cash from the emergency jar I kept in the kitchen. They were floating on a cloud of absolute entitlement, entirely unaware that the ground beneath them had been incinerated. The first sign of trouble was the silence. Usually the house hummed, the pool filter, the central air, the landscape lighting, all creating a low, expensive noise. Today the house was dark. The curtains were missing from the upstairs windows, leaving the glass looking back at them like hollow black eyes. Patricia walked up the front steps, her heels clicking on the stone. She reached for the front door handle. Locked. She frowned. She entered her code into the smart lock. Her birthday. The keypad flashed red. She tried again, perhaps thinking she'd miscounted the digits, pressing harder this time. Red light. Access denied. I can imagine her irritation beginning to brew into annoyance. She would have called out my name, assuming I was inside playing a joke, or that I had engaged the deadbolt. "Robert, open the door. The code isn't working." Madison walked up, holding a Starbucks cup. "Move over, Mom. You must be hitting the wrong buttons." Madison tried her code, the day she graduated high school. Red light. Access denied. That was the exact moment irritation turned to cold dread. Because it wasn't just that the door wouldn't open. The sound was wrong. When you knock on a fully furnished house, the sound is absorbed. When you knock on an empty house, it echoes. It sounds hollow. It sounds like a drum. Madison stepped off the porch and walked around to the large bay window of the living room. She cupped her hands against the glass to block out the afternoon glare. She looked inside. I wish I could have seen her face. I wish I could have seen the moment her brain tried to process the visual data. The living room was gone. The white sofas were gone. The 75-inch TV was gone. The rugs were gone. There was nothing but a vast expanse of hardwood floor stretching into the shadows. "Mom," she whispered, "the house is empty." Patricia ran to the window. She gasped, dropping her purse on the ground. Her hands clawed against the glass like a trapped bird. "We've been robbed!" she screamed. "Oh my God, Robert! Where's Robert? Call 911. We've been cleaned out." They didn't understand. Robbers take TVs and jewelry. Robbers don't take the curtains. Robbers don't take the heavy oak dining table. Panic makes people irrational. They ran around the back of the house. They tried the patio doors. Locked. They tried the kitchen window. Locked. Finally, Madison remembered the spare key hidden in the fake rock by the garden hose. The spare key I had warned them a dozen times was a security risk. Or rather, the spare key I had intentionally left there for this exact moment, because I wanted them to get inside. I wanted them to experience the acoustic horror of the echo. Madison smashed the fake rock against the patio pavers, popping the plastic cap off. She slammed the key into the back door. It turned. Tommen gasping for air, they burst into the kitchen, braced to confront an intruder. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Patricia screamed, grabbing a heavy brass candlestick the movers had left behind because it was broken. Silence answered them, a heavy, dusty silence. They walked through the kitchen. It was unrecognizable. The countertops were bare. The coffee maker, the toaster, the blender, all gone. The refrigerator door was slightly ajar, revealing a dark, empty interior. The only light came from the afternoon sun cutting through unadorned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. And then they saw it. In the center of the kitchen, in the massive empty space where the island used to be, the island that was always cluttered with bar stools and fruit baskets, stood a single thin metal folding chair. It was facing the granite counter, and on that counter sat a thick manila envelope. It looked like an altar, a shrine to the end of their world. They walked toward it slowly, the click of their heels deafening in the vacant space. Patricia reached the envelope first. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely undo the clasp. She slid the documents out. The first page was the settlement statement for the sale of the house, a standard real estate form, but to her it must have looked like a death certificate. It showed the date of sale, yesterday. It showed the possession deadline, 5 p.m. today. It showed the seller, Robert Sullivan. It showed the net proceeds wired to an offshore account they had never seen before. Sold, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. He sold the house. Madison grabbed the second stack of papers. These were colored. They were receipts from the wedding vendors. Florist, canceled. Refund issued to cardholder. Catering, canceled. Refund issued to cardholder. Venue, canceled. Deposit forfeited. Band, canceled. Every dream she had ordered, every orchid, every lobster tail, gone. No, Madison groaned, leaning against the counter as her legs went weak. No, no, no. The wedding is in 4 days. He can't do this. He can't just cancel it. But there was one final piece of paper in the envelope, a handwritten letter on my personal stationery, written calmly while sitting at this very counter 2 days prior. Patricia read it aloud, her voice breaking and trembling with every word. Dear Patricia and Madison, you wanted a wedding hosted by the father of the bride. You made it perfectly clear that Gary is the father, and I am simply the bank. I have decided to honor your wishes. I have removed myself and my funding from the equation. The house has been sold. The new owners take possession today at 5 p.m. You are currently trespassing. The contracts for the wedding were in my name. Since I am not the father, I have canceled them. Gary, as the true father, is entirely free to rebook them. I have left the contact numbers below. I am sure he will be more than happy to provide his credit card information. Do not look for me. I am gone. Do not look for the money. It is gone too. Sincerely, Robert. The scream that tore from Madison's throat was primal. It wasn't a cry of grief. It was the rage of a parasite that had just been forcibly detached from its host. She swept her arm across the counter, sending the paperwork flying onto the floor. He ruined it! He ruined my life! She shrieked, kicking the folding chair. It clattered loudly against the vacant kitchen floor, flipping onto its side. Patricia slid down the front of the cabinets until she was sitting on the floor amidst the scattered papers, looking around at the shell of the mansion she thought she owned. She looked at the spot on the wall where her portrait used to hang. Now there was only a white square. Where are we going to sleep? Patricia whimpered. Robert, where are we going to sleep? Her voice echoed up the stairs, bouncing off the walls of empty bedrooms, dissolving into the nothingness I had left behind. Just then the front door opened. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. It was Gary. He had finally arrived, likely looking for a cold beer and a place to crash. Hey, he shouted. Why is the TV gone? Did you guys decide to redecorate already? Madison began to laugh. It was a sharp, hysterical sound that bordered on madness. Welcome home, Dad, she screamed at the empty ceiling. Welcome home! The sound that broke the silence of the kitchen wasn't a scream. It was a vibration. It was Madison's phone buzzing on the bare granite counter. Then Patricia's phone buzzed. Then Tyler's. He had just walked through the open back door, freezing in place as he surveyed the emptiness. It was a symphony of notifications, a digital firing squad assembling for the execution. I had timed the cancellation emails to send at exactly 5 p.m. In the corporate world, Wednesday at 5 p.m. is when you deliver bad news so you don't have to deal with the fallout until the next morning. But for them, there would be no next morning. Madison picked up her phone first, her hand shaking so violently she almost dropped it. It was an email from the catering company, the one we had visited just days prior to upgrade the menu to lobster and filet mignon. The subject line was in all caps, urgent cancellation and outstanding balance. She read it aloud, her voice thin and trembling like a lost child. Dear Ms. Miller, We have been notified by Mr. Sullivan that his financial sponsorship of your event has been withdrawn immediately. Per the contract signed by yourself and Mr. Tyler Vance, all outstanding balances are due immediately upon cancellation within 72 hours of the event date. She stopped, swallowing hard. Read the number, Tyler snapped. He was standing in the doorway, his face pale. He knew what was coming. Madison choked out the digits. $42,580. They're charging the full amount because the food has already been ordered. They say if the funds aren't wired by noon tomorrow, they're sending it to collections and suing us for breach of contract. 40 grand? Gary let out a nervous chuckle, cracking his knuckles. That's a mistake. Just call Bob. Tell him to stop playing games. He isn't playing games, Dad, Madison screamed, turning on him. He's gone. Don't you understand? He sold the house. He canceled the checks. He's gone. Before the echo of her scream could fade, another notification popped up. This time it was the florist, the woman who had promised Vogue-worthy orchids. Madison stared at the screen. Celine says she already ordered the flowers from Thailand. She says they're non-refundable. She's charging the remaining $15,000 to the card on file. The card on file. Everyone's eyes turned to Tyler. It was his card, the one his parents had co-signed, the one he had proudly produced when he thought I would be reimbursing the full amount. Tyler unlocked his phone frantically, opening his banking app. I can only imagine how the blood drained from his face as he saw the pending transactions. The venue, the florist, the band, the lighting crew. Everyone was rushing to claim their piece before the well ran dry. No, Tyler whispered. No, 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 this can't be happening. That's my parents' money. That was our down payment for a house. He looked up at Madison, and for the first time, there was no adoration in his eyes. No love. Just the cold, calculating realization of a man who knew he had made a terrible investment. You told me he would pay, Tyler said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. You stood in that flower shop and told me to swipe the card because Robert always handles the bill. You said he was a pushover. I thought he was, Madison wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive facial. He always pays. He's always paid. I don't know why he's doing this. You pushed him too hard, Patricia said from the floor, her voice a whisper. She was hugging her knees, rocking back and forth. The suit, the invitation. You humiliated him, Madison. I told you not to push him on the father issue. Oh, shut up, Mom, Madison roared. You were laughing about it. You were the one who said we could kick him out after the honeymoon. Tyler stepped into the room. He looked at the empty space where the refrigerator used to be. He looked at Gary, the man standing there in a dirty t-shirt, looking useless and overwhelmed. He looked at Madison, who was now just a girl with a mountain of debt and no stepfather to bail her out. My credit score, Tyler said, his voice rising to a shout. Do you know what this is going to do to my credit score? My dad is going to kill me. He co-signed that card on the condition that we only use it for emergencies. This is an emergency, Madison pleaded, reaching out for him. Tyler, babe, we can figure this out. We just need to... Tyler cut her off, stepping back from her touch, as if she were contagious. There is no we anymore, Madison. Not anymore. I signed up to marry into a lifestyle. I signed up for a house in Greenwich, a trust fund, and security. I didn't sign up to marry his daughter. He pointed a trembling finger at Gary. Gary bristled, trying to summon a shred of manhood. Hey, watch your mouth, kid. You're talking about my daughter. Yeah, Tyler sneered. Then pay for it. You're the father of the bride, right? That's what the invitation said, Mr. Gary Miller. So go ahead, Gary. Pull out your wallet and write a check for $57,000 to cover the lobsters and the dead flowers. Go on, I'm waiting. The room went completely dead. The truth hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Gary didn't have $57,000. Gary didn't have $57. He had a pickup truck that needed a new transmission and a bar tab at the local dive. Tyler let out a harsh, bitter laugh. That's what I thought. You're all frauds. You've been living off that old man's money, acting like royalty, and you're nothing. You're absolutely nothing. Tyler turned around, walking toward the door. Where are you going? Madison shrieked, running after him. Tyler, the wedding is in 4 days. What am I supposed to tell people? Tell them the groom regained his senses, Tyler said without looking back. He walked out the front door, got into his leased BMW, and sped down the driveway. Madison stood in the doorway, watching the taillights disappear, just as I had done hours earlier. But I had left with my dignity. She was left with a mountain of cancellation fees. She turned back into the kitchen. Patricia was sobbing softly. Gary was rummaging through the empty cabinets, hoping to find a bottle of liquor the movers might have missed. Madison looked at her phone again. Another email had arrived. It was from the wedding planner. Dear Madison, due to non-payment of the final balance, we are releasing your date to another couple on our wait list. Please note that your deposit is non-refundable. She slid down the doorframe until she was sitting on the floor, burying her face in her hands. Robert, she whimpered into the darkness of the empty house. Dad, please answer. But the phone she was calling was currently sitting at the bottom of a trash can in an airport terminal, and the man she was calling was 4,000 miles away, ordering a glass of Chianti and finally enjoying the silence. I had checked into a suite at the St. Regis, waiting for an evening flight to Rome. It was a pristine, beautiful room that smelled of starched linens and expensive lilies, a welcome contrast to the gutted house in Greenwich. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and opened my iPad. I had turned my phone off, but I knew the storm was raging. I just didn't know the velocity of the wind until I logged into Instagram. Years ago, I had created a burner account with no identifying information to monitor Madison's spending habits, as she often posted her unauthorized purchases before the credit card statements arrived. Today, her profile wasn't displaying designer bags or avocado toast. It was displaying a tragedy. She was live. The notification showed she had 40,000 viewers. I clicked on the stream. Madison was sitting on the floor of the empty kitchen I had vacated just hours before. She had set up her ring light because even in the depths of despair, lighting is paramount. She was wearing a hoodie, and I recognized it. It was mine, an old college sweatshirt she hadn't touched a day in her life before today. Her makeup was mostly removed, save for a perfectly smudged line of mascara under her eyes to suggest she had been crying for hours. Hey guys, she said softly, her voice pitched perfectly to imply heartbreak. I didn't want to make this video. I really didn't, but I don't know who else to turn to. She paused, looking down at her hands. The comments were scrolling so fast they were a blur of broken hearts and angry faces. My stepfather, Robert, the man I've called Dad for 15 years, has abandoned us. She looked directly into the camera lens, and for a second I had to admire the performance. It was Oscar-worthy. He left us with nothing, she continued, a single tear escaping and tracing down her cheek. He sold our home behind our backs. He canceled my wedding 4 days before the ceremony. He drained the bank accounts. And the worst part is, he did it because he was jealous. I took a sip of my water. Jealous. So that was the angle. He was jealous that I wanted to reconnect with my biological father, Gary, she sobbed. Gary has been working so hard to be in my life, and Robert just couldn't handle not being the center of attention. He told me if I let Gary walk me down the aisle, he would ruin me. I thought he was joking. I didn't think he would actually leave me and my mother homeless. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. She had surgically removed her own cruelty, cut out the insults, and stitched together a narrative that made me the monster. No mention of the demand for the Armani suit. No mention of just Robert. No mention of the debt she and Tyler had aggressively run up themselves. I looked at the comments. The internet mob, that brainless beast that feeds on manufactured outrage, was fully awake. What a monster. This is financial abuse. Dox him. Find out where he is. Someone needs to teach this old man a lesson. Madison wiped her nose with her sleeve. I don't care about the money, she lied. I just care about the heartbreak. I feel so unsafe. We're sleeping on the floor tonight. If anyone sees him, please tell him that whatever we did to make him this angry, we're sorry. We just want him to come home. It was a masterclass in manipulation. She wasn't asking for money directly. She was crowdfunding a vendetta. She was holding out a cup for digital charity while painting a bullseye on my back. I closed the iPad. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, detached satisfaction. In her desperation to destroy me, she had made a fatal tactical error. She had made it public. She had put her lies on the record. In a court of law, private conversations are hearsay, but a live stream with 40,000 witnesses is an exhibit. She had just handed my lawyer the grounds for a defamation suit that would garnish her wages for the rest of her life. But the internet moves faster than the law. I needed to return my rental car before my flight. I had rented an inconspicuous sedan to avoid attention, but I had forgotten one detail. My face was now on every smartphone in the tri-state area. Madison had posted a photo of me in her next story, a picture from last Christmas where I looked stern and unsmiling, fitting her narrative of the cold tyrant perfectly. I took the elevator down to the garage. The valet brought the car around. He looked at me strangely. He held on to the keys a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "You look a lot like that guy," the valet said, narrowing his eyes. "The one on TikTok, the dad who canceled the wedding." I took the keys from his hand. "I have one of those faces," I said evenly. I got into the car and drove out into the street. I was only a few blocks from the hotel when I was caught by a red light at a busy intersection. The city was crowded. People were staring at their phones. I noticed a group of teenagers on the corner. One of them looked up. He pointed at the car. He shouted something to his friends. They looked at their phones, then at me. The realization washed over their faces. It wasn't the look of fans. It was the look of hunters. "That's him!" the kid screamed. "That's the deadbeat!" I stared straight ahead. The light was still red. One of the kids was holding a drink, some kind of thick red slushy. He ran into the street. "For Madison!" he shouted, hurling the cup at my car. The cup exploded against the driver's side window. The thick red liquid splattered across the glass, dripping down like a horror movie special effect, completely blocking my view of the side mirror. The other kids cheered, holding up their phones, recording their moment of heroism, attacking an old man in a sedan because a girl cried online. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't shout. I didn't get out to confront them. That's exactly what they wanted. They wanted the angry tyrant. They wanted the viral video of me losing control. The light turned green. I turned on the windshield wipers. The rubber blades dragged the red syrup across the glass, smearing it before clearing a small, fan-shaped window of visibility. I pressed the accelerator and drove through the intersection, keeping my pulse steady. I looked in the rearview mirror. The kids were high-fiving. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated me. I drove the remaining miles to the airport with the drying red stain baked onto the side of the car. People honked. People stared. In the city I had spent decades helping to build, I was a pariah. When I pulled into the rental return lane, the attendant walked around the vehicle. He stopped at the smear. "What happened here?" he asked, frowning. "A misunderstanding," I said, handing him the keys. "Charge the cleaning fee to the cart." I grabbed my suitcases and walked into the terminal. I could feel the eyes on me, but I kept my chin up. Let them look. Let them hate. They were watching a movie where they missed the first act. They didn't know the ending yet. I found a quiet corner in the first-class lounge and called Arthur Blackwood. "Did you see it?" Arthur asked, his voice gravelly and thick. He sounded like he was suppressing either a cough or a laugh. "I saw it," I said. "I also saw the paint on my car." "Excellent," Arthur said. "That's property damage and incitement. We just added 2 zeros to the countersuit settlement. Are you safe?" "I board in an hour," I said. "Arthur, I want that video preserved. Download it. Save the comments. Save the threats." "I'm way ahead of you, Robert," Arthur replied. "She's digging her own financial grave with that ring light. By the way, the florist called my office. She's threatening to sue you for fraud." "Let her try," I said. The contract was in Tyler's name. I was a third party who decided not to extend a gift. There's no law against being a disappointing stepfather. Arthur laughed. "You are a cold bastard, Sullivan. Enjoy Italy. By the time you land, I'll have the draft for the restraining orders ready for your review." I hung up and looked out the window at the runway. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tarmac. I was leaving the chaos behind, the red syrup, the shouting teenagers, the crying influencer. I opened the iPad one last time and checked Madison's profile. The video was over, but she had posted a story update. It was a selfie of her and Patricia in the dark kitchen holding a candle. The caption read, The darkness is scary, but our love is brighter. Hashtag survivor. Hashtag justice for Madison. I scrolled down to the comments. In a sea of support, I saw one from an account named Gary the Legend. Don't worry, baby girl, Daddy's here, we're gonna make him pay. I smiled. Gary had taken the bait. He was playing the protector, the provider, the hero. He was stepping right into a bear trap. I shut down the iPad and walked toward the gate. The attendant scanned my boarding pass. Have a wonderful flight, Mr. Sullivan, she said. I looked at her, and for the first time in days, the muscles in my face relaxed into a genuine smile. Oh, I will, I said. I really will. I walked down the jet bridge, leaving the country with the reputation of a villain, knowing that by the time I returned, I would be the plaintiff. But for now, let them have their internet points. Let them have their viral fame. Because while they were playing for likes, I was playing for my life, and I had just won the most important battle without firing a single shot. The internet mob was howling for blood online, but I knew that digital threats rarely stay digital, especially when alcohol is involved. I had rented a small, nondescript townhouse on the outskirts of the city, registered under a shell company so no one could trace it to Robert Sullivan. Or so I thought. But anger has a way of sharpening the senses, and Gary had likely spent the last few hours intimidating my former neighbors, until one of them, tired of the drama, gave up the license plate of my rental car. It was just past midnight when I heard it, the roar of a truck engine on the quiet street, followed by the harsh scrape of tires hitting the curb. I sat in the darkness of the living room, fully expecting this. In fact, I was counting on it. I checked the app on my phone. The notifications were green. System armed. Camera 1 recording. Camera 2 recording. I slid the phone into my pocket and stood up, straightening the collar of my shirt. I positioned myself in the center of the room, directly within the wide-angle frame of the lens hidden on the bookshelf. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, slowing my heart rate down to a steady rhythm. Then came the pounding, a heavy, rhythmic slamming against the front door that shook the frame. "Open up, you coward!" Gary's voice was slurred, thick with cheap whiskey and misplaced righteousness. "Open the door, Bob. I know you're in there." I didn't move. I didn't call out. I simply waited. The pounding stopped for a second, replaced by the sound of shattering glass, as he put a landscaping stone through the side window, reaching an arm inside to fumble with the lock. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with a loud bang. Gary stumbled into the foyer, looking completely unhinged. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt soaked in sweat, swaying on his feet. In one hand he held a baseball bat, dragging it along the floor with a menacing scrape. "There you are," he sneered, blinking into the darkness. "Sitting there like a king while my daughter cries her eyes out." He took a step toward me, raising the bat. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can just cut people off? You think having money makes you a man?" I looked at him, noting his loose stance, his unprotected chin, and the way he held all his weight on his heels. Decades ago, before I wore a suit and looked at financial statements, I wore a different uniform. I was a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I served 2 tours overseas. I learned hand-to-hand combat from men who treated violence as a science. I knew exactly how to disarm a man with a bat. I knew how to shatter his kneecap with a single kick. I knew how to put Gary on the floor and ensure he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. My muscles tensed, the instinct to attack and neutralize the threat surging through me. It would have been easy. It would have been incredibly satisfying. But I forced my hands to stay at my sides. I forced my muscles to relax. If I fought back, it was a mutual altercation, a dispute between 2 men, a brawl. But if I stood still, if I let him assault an unarmed senior citizen in my own home, then it was a felony. It was assault with a deadly weapon. It was prison time. I made the calculation in a fraction of a second. I chose to take the hit. "Gary," I said, keeping my voice steady and loud enough for the microphone to catch every syllable, "please leave. You're trespassing. I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" Gary laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You are the trouble, Bob, and I'm here to fix it." He swung his arm. Thankfully, he didn't use the bat. Even in his drunken rage, maybe some deep part of him realized that would cross a legal line he couldn't recover from. Instead, he dropped the bat and lunged at me with his fists. His first punch caught me right on the jaw. It was a sloppy, looping hook, but it carried the full weight of a 200-pound man. My head snapped back. I tasted the sharp, copper tang of blood. I could feel my lips splitting open against my teeth. I stumbled back a few steps, pretending to be weaker than I actually was. I crashed into a bookshelf, sending a decorative vase shattering to the floor. "Please," I said, holding up my hands in a defensive posture, making absolutely sure not to strike back. "Gary, stop. You're drunk." "Shut up!" he screamed. He grabbed the collar of my shirt, slamming me hard against the wall. He raised his fist again. "This is for Madison!" he yelled. He hit me again, this time in the ribs. The air left my lungs in a sharp grunt. It was a blinding, breathless kind of pain. I felt a massive bruise blooming immediately under the skin. I slid down the wall, curling into a ball on the floor, protecting my head with my arms. "Is that all you got?" he spat, kicking me hard in the thigh. "You're pathetic. You're soft." I didn't get up. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. I knew the silent alarm had been triggered the exact moment the glass broke. The local police department had a response time of under 5 minutes. Gary stood over me, chest heaving, looking like a conqueror. He thought he had won. He thought he had taught me a lesson. "See how that feels?" he taunted. "See what it feels like to be completely powerless?" I looked up at him through the dim light. My jaw was throbbing, my ribs were on fire, but my mind was perfectly clear. "I'm not the one who's powerless, Gary," I whispered. Before he could process what I meant, the room was suddenly flooded with strobing red and blue lights. The sirens didn't start until the patrol cars pulled up outside. A tactical, silent approach. Gary froze. He looked toward the open door. He looked at the flashing lights reflecting off the broken glass. Confusion washed over his face. He lowered his hands. "Police, show me your hands." 2 officers burst through the door, weapons drawn. They saw a shattered window. They saw a baseball bat on the floor. They saw a bleeding older man on the ground and a drunk man standing over him. It wasn't a difficult scene to read. "Get on the ground, now!" the lead officer barked, advancing rapidly. Gary tried to step back, raising his hands clumsily. "Wait, no, you don't understand. He started it. He stole my daughter's wedding." "On the ground!" The police didn't care about family drama. They cared about a threat. They tackled Gary onto the hardwood floor. I leaned against the wall, watching them pull his arms behind his back and snap the cuffs into place. I watched as they began to read him his Miranda rights. I watched the arrogance drain out of him, replaced by a sudden, stark terror of what had just happened. "You're under arrest for burglary, assault, and battery," the officer recited. Gary looked at me as they hauled him to his feet. His eyes were wide, completely full of desperation now. Bob, tell them. Tell them it was just a misunderstanding. Bob, I can't go to jail. I have a record. They're going to say I violated parole." I slowly used the bookshelf to pull myself up. I wiped the blood from my lip with the back of my hand. I looked directly at the officer. "I want to press charges," I said, pronouncing every word perfectly. "And I have the entire incident recorded on video." Gary's knees buckled. In that exact second he knew. He finally realized he hadn't walked into a brawl. He had walked into a trap. As they dragged him out the door, kicking and screaming about his rights, I reached into my pocket and turned off the recording. I walked over to the mirror in the hallway. My face was swollen. My shirt was torn. I looked like a victim. But as I stared at my reflection, I didn't see one. I saw a man who had just traded a split lip for his enemy's freedom. It was a bargain. A few minutes later, the EMTs arrived. One of them shined a penlight into my eyes. "You took a real beating, sir," he said gently. "We need to get you to the hospital." I nodded. "Yes, let's go." I needed the medical report. I needed the x-rays. I needed every single bruise documented, time-stamped, and filed. Madison wanted to tell a story to her followers. I was about to give her the breaking news. As I lay on the stretcher in the back of the ambulance, I pulled out my phone. I uploaded the audio and video files to the cloud. I sent a copy to Arthur Blackwood with a 2-word message. "File it," Arthur replied within seconds. "Understood. I'll have this in front of the arraignment judge before breakfast. He isn't getting bail." As the ambulance pulled away, I closed my eyes. The sharp pain in my ribs settled into a dull ache, but the lightness in my chest was indescribable. Gary was finished. The real dad was behind bars. Now there were only Madison and Patricia left on the board, and they were about to realize their heavy hitter, their protector, their hero, was nothing more than collateral damage in a war they never should have started. I listened to the siren wailing into the night sky. To anyone else, it sounded like an emergency. To me, it sounded like victory. Saturday arrived, but the sun did not. The weather forecast I checked from the comfortable balcony of my hotel room in Rome showed a torrential downpour hitting Connecticut. And for once, the meteorologists were absolutely right. It was the kind of rain that felt personally targeted, a relentless, freezing sheet of water that turned the world gray and miserable. It was perfect weather for a funeral, which was fitting, because a marriage was about to end before it even had a chance to take its first breath. I wasn't there, of course. I was thousands of miles away, enjoying a plate of truffle pasta. But thanks to the digital age and the internet's ravenous appetite, I saw every single frame of the disaster. Madison, in her unending thirst for attention, had insisted on live streaming the ceremony, hoping to score sympathy points for her bravery in the face of adversity. She thought the world would see a tragic heroine doing her best in a bad situation. Instead, they tuned in for a train wreck. The venue had changed. There was no vineyard, no crystal chandeliers. The vintage Rolls-Royce had vanished. The wedding was held in the backyard of Tyler's parents' house, a neighborhood Madison had previously referred to as the Sticks. It was a small, cramped patch of dying grass enclosed by a chain-link fence that sagged to the left. A blue plastic tarp had been strung between two oak trees to serve as an altar, flapping violently in the wind like a distress signal. The guest list had cratered. Out of 200 invited, 12 showed up, mostly Tyler's relatives, holding cheap cans of beer and looking uncomfortable in ill-fitting suits. Madison's carefully cultivated high society friends, the influencers, the models, none of them appeared. They had smelled the poverty and the scandal, scattering like roaches when the lights came on. The video feed was shaky, held by Patricia, whose hands were trembling. I could hear the wind howling into the microphone, distorting the audio, but the visual was crystal clear. Madison stepped out of the back door of the house. She was wearing the $10,000 gown I had refused to pay for, which meant she had likely maxed out another credit card that was about to bounce. It was a beautiful dress, designed for a cathedral, not a swamp. The moment her satin heels hit the ground, she sank. The mud was thick, dark, and hungry. It claimed her shoes instantly. She stumbled, grabbing the doorframe to steady herself. The pristine white lace of her train dragged through a puddle of oily rainwater. A brown stain began to spread across the fabric, climbing higher with every step she took. There was no music. The portable stereo they had set up had shorted out in the rain 10 minutes earlier. There was nothing but the sound of the storm and a neighbor's dog barking in the distance. She walked down the makeshift aisle, a path of flattened cardboard boxes that were rapidly dissolving into pulp. Her hair, which she had likely spent hours curling, was plastered to her scalp. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark rivets. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like a shipwreck survivor. Tyler was waiting under the tearing blue tarp. He looked miserable. His cheap suit was thoroughly soaked, clinging to his frame. The look he gave Madison wasn't one of love. It was the cold, cruel clarity of a man who realized exactly what his life had become. He looked at the mud on her dress. He looked at the chain-link fence. He looked at his future, and he hated it. Madison reached the altar. She was shaking violently. She reached out to take Tyler's hands, but he kept them shoved deep in his pockets. "Let's just get this over with," Tyler muttered. The microphone on Patricia's phone caught it perfectly. The officiant, a friend of Tyler's who had obtained an online certification for $20, cleared his throat and opened a waterlogged notebook. "We are gathered here today," he began to yell over the thunder, "to join this man and this woman." He never got to finish the sentence. A violent gust of wind caught the corner of the blue tarp. It snapped loose, coming down with a heavy, wet slap directly across Tyler's face, dumping a gallon of trapped rainwater over his head. That was the breaking point. Not the debt, not the arrest of his father-in-law. It was the water. It was the pure, undeniable indignity of the moment. Tyler wiped the rain from his eyes. He looked at Madison, who was sobbing silently, her makeup a streaked horror show. "I can't do this," he said. Madison froze. "What?" "I can't do this," Tyler repeated, louder this time. "Look at this, Madison. Look at us. We're standing in the mud. My dad is inside watching a game because he thinks this is a joke. Your dad is in jail. Your mom is homeless. And you?" He pointed at her ruined dress. "You're not the prize anymore, Maddie. You were supposed to come with a house. You were supposed to come with a trust fund. You were supposed to come with a life." Madison gasped, a sound of pure shock. "Tyler, how can you say that? You love me, right?" Tyler let out a harsh, cruel laugh that cut through the rain. "Love you? Or love the trips to St. Bart's? Did I love the dinners at Le Bernardin? Or the fact that your stepfather paid my car insurance? I'm 27 years old, Madison, and because of this week, I'm nearly $100,000 in debt. Collectors are already calling my mother. For what? To live in a basement apartment with you while you complain that you deserve better?" He shook his head, stepping out from under the ruined tarp, letting the rain soak him completely. "I'm out. I'm cutting my losses." He turned around and began walking toward the house. "Tyler!" Madison screamed. She tried to run after him, but the weight of her dress, bogged down by pounds of muddy water, anchored her. She tripped, plunging face first into the mud. It was a moment of absolute humiliation, the princess in the swamp. Tyler didn't stop. He didn't look back. He walked into the house and slammed the door behind him. Patricia's phone hit the ground. The camera tilted up, filming the gray sky and the wet grass, but the audio kept recording. I could hear Madison screaming. It wasn't a cry of heartbreak. It was the shriek of a child who had been told no for the first time in her life and couldn't process the reality. "Come back!" she screamed, her voice hoarse and hysterical. "You can't leave me. I'm a Sullivan. I'm a Sullivan." But she wasn't a Sullivan. She never had been. She was a Miller. And now she was just a girl covered in filth, left alone in the rain, finally realizing that without my checkbook, she was entirely transparent. The live stream cut out abruptly. Either the phone died, or Patricia finally realized the world had seen enough. I closed my laptop. The waiter placed a fresh espresso on my table. "Everything all right, sir?" he asked, noting my stare at the screen. "Everything is flawless," I replied. I took a sip of the coffee. It was rich, dark, and bitter, the exact taste of accountability. The wedding was over. The marriage was dead. The alliance of parasites had turned on itself, just as I knew it would. When you starve a pack of wolves, they don't hunt together. They eat the weakest member. Tyler had escaped, but he was financially broken. Madison was socially and emotionally leveled. Patricia was watching her retirement plan dissolve in the mud. I leaned back in my chair, watching the sunset over Rome. It was beautiful, bathing the ancient city in shades of gold and amber. I took a deep breath. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel the weight of expectations pressing against my chest. I didn't feel the anxiety of the next bill. I was free. But I wasn't done. There was one final act, the legal cleanup, the last nail in the coffin. Because while they were drowning in the mud, I had a court date to attend, and I planned to show up in a custom suit, ready to reclaim the last thing they tried to steal from me, my reputation. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent I had spent the last 40 years associating with corporate mergers. Today it smelled like the final act of a tragedy. I sat at the defense table wearing a navy blue custom suit I had picked up in Milan. My skin was bronzed from the Roman sun, and my hands were perfectly steady. Across the aisle, the view was entirely different. Patricia sat slumped in her chair, wearing a black dress that looked 2 sizes too big, likely something she pulled from a clearance rack after I donated her entire wardrobe to charity. She looked old, her face pale and drawn, the result of a week spent in a motel with a hysterical daughter and a fiancé awaiting trial. Sitting next to her was her attorney, Mr. Sterling. He was exactly what I expected, a vulture in a cheap suit, the kind of lawyer who follows ambulances and advertises on the back of bus benches. He was clicking his pen aggressively, trying to look intimidating. He had no idea I had faced down federal regulators and hostile takeovers. A man like Sterling wasn't a predator to me, he was a snack. My lawyer, Arthur Blackwood, sat beside me, entirely silent. He didn't click a pen, He didn't rustle papers. He sat with the dead stillness of a cobra waiting to strike. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Judge Harrison entered. She was a woman in her late 60s with eyes that had looked through every lie a human being could utter. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the tables. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed," she said, sounding already bored. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket. He walked to the center of the room, turning on the theatrics. "Your Honor," he began, his voice booming as he pointed dramatically at Patricia. "We are here today to correct a grave injustice. My client, a dedicated wife and mother of 15 years, has been the victim of financial abuse, abandonment, and cruelty. Her husband, Mr. Sullivan, secretly sold their marital home, liquidated their joint assets, and fled the country, leaving her utterly destitute. We are asking for an immediate freeze on all of Mr. Sullivan's assets, temporary spousal support of $10,000 a month, and 50% of the marital property, including his retirement accounts." Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "A touching performance." Sterling continued. "Mr. Sullivan claims there is a postnuptial agreement. We contend that this document was signed under duress. Mrs. Sullivan was forced into signing it without proper legal representation, manipulated by a man who held all the financial power. As such, the document is void, and she is entitled to her fair share." He sat down, looking pleased with himself. He thought he had made a compelling case for a helpless housewife. Arthur Blackwood rose slowly. He didn't walk to the center of the room. He stayed behind our table. "Your Honor," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "we are not here to debate emotion. We are here to debate facts." Arthur picked up a document. "Exhibit A," he said, "the postnuptial agreement, signed 5 years ago, notarized. And contrary to Mr. Sterling's claim of duress, it was reviewed at the time by independent counsel." Sterling jumped up. "Objection! That counsel was paid for by Mr. Sullivan." "Overruled," the judge said. "Continue, Mr. Blackwood." Arthur walked toward the bench. "The reason for this agreement is crucial, Your Honor. Mr. Sterling claims his client was manipulated. The truth is, Mrs. Sullivan had accumulated $150,000 in gambling debt." A murmur went through the small courtroom. Patricia froze. She hadn't told her lawyer. Arthur placed a stack of bank statements on the judge's bench. "These are the records from 3 casinos in Atlantic City. These are the withdrawals from the joint savings account. And this is a wire transfer from Mr. Sullivan, paying off a loan shark to protect his wife from physical harm. Mr. Sullivan agreed to cover the debt on one condition: she waive her rights to his premarital assets, protecting his financial future from her addiction. This wasn't duress, Your Honor. This was a rescue." Patricia's face turned bright red. Sterling looked at her, hissing under his breath, "Why didn't you tell me this?" But Arthur wasn't finished. "However," Arthur continued, turning to face Patricia, "we do not rely solely on the gambling. We rely on the collusion to defraud clause within that very agreement." He walked back to our table and picked up a small flash drive. "Section 4. Paragraph B states that the agreement is binding and all spousal support is forfeited if either party engages in any conspiracy against the financial interests of the primary earner or attempts to divert assets through deception to a third party." Sterling scoffed. "Conspiracy? That's a reach. My client has been a loyal wife." Arthur smiled, a chilling expression. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce Exhibit C, a digital audio recording captured on the Friday before the scheduled wedding." I looked at Patricia. She looked confused. She didn't know about the recording. Her mind was racing, trying to remember what she had said. Arthur plugged the drive into the courtroom's audio system. This recording was obtained legally via a device placed within Mr. Sullivan's private property, specifically the pocket of a suit jacket he had loaned to Mr. Gary Miller. Gary's name hit Patricia like a physical blow. The color drained from her skin. Arthur hit play. The courtroom speakers crackled, and then, clear as day, Gary's voice filled the room. "Man, I love this room. Smells like money." Then came the sound of fabric rustling. "Patty and I were talking last night. She's worried about you. Thinks you're getting too old for a house this big." I watched the judge's face. Her eyebrows rose. The recording continued, Gary's voice arrogant and mocking. "We were thinking maybe after the wedding it's time for a change. Sell this place. Buy you a nice, comfortable little condo down in Florida with cash. Then, well, the rest of the equity could really help Madison and Tyler get started. And it's time Patty enjoyed herself, don't you think? Patricia put her hand over her mouth, shaking her head. Then came the final blow, the segment Arthur had enhanced for absolute clarity, recorded later that night when Gary met Tyler at the bar. The old fool is completely bought in. Patty's got him wrapped around her finger. She says she's filing for divorce anyway once the honeymoon is covered. We just need him to liquidate the house into cash first. Then we take half. It's the perfect retirement plan. Silence. Absolute dead silence. The recording stopped. Arthur looked up at the judge. Your Honor, this is a recording of Mr. Gary Miller, the man Mrs. Sullivan insisted on bringing into the wedding party, admitting to a conspiracy with Mrs. Sullivan to defraud my client of his home equity before divorcing him after exploiting his funds for the wedding. Sterling sat down. He didn't say a word. He closed his folder. He knew when a ship was sunk. Patricia stood up. That's a lie. That's just Gary talking nonsense. I never said those things. Sit down, Mrs. Sullivan, the judge snapped. Judge Harrison looked at me, then at Patricia. The disgust on her face was clear. I've heard enough, the judge said, not even needing to recess. The claim of duress is dismissed. The post-nuptial agreement stands as legal and enforceable. Furthermore, based on the evidence of collusion to defraud, I'm granting Mr. Sullivan's motion to dismiss any request for spousal support with prejudice. She struck her gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. You get nothing, Mrs. Sullivan. You will cover your own legal fees. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you collect your retainer up front, because there are no assets left to garnish here. Court is adjourned. Patricia let out a wail that echoed off the mahogany walls. She grabbed Sterling's arm, but he shook her off, packing his briefcase with aggressive speed. You said we would win, Patricia screamed at him. You said I'd get the house. I didn't know you were planning a robbery with your ex-husband, Sterling snapped back. Good luck, Mrs. Sullivan. Don't call my office. I stood up and Arthur shook my hand. Good job, Arthur, I said. I buttoned my jacket and turned to leave. I had to pass her table. Patricia looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her makeup ruined. She looked frail. For the first time in my life, I looked at her and didn't see the beautiful woman I had married. I saw her for what she truly was, a tired, desperate gambler who had played her last card and lost. Robert, she whispered. Robert, please. I have nowhere to go. Madison is sleeping on a friend's couch. I can't stay in that motel forever. I paused, looking down at her. You still have Gary, I said softly. He's in jail, she sobbed. You put him there. Then wait for him, I said. You two deserve each other. I walked out the courtroom doors. The hallway was bright and quiet. I passed the vending machines where Madison was sitting, staring at her phone, waiting for the news of her mother's legal lottery win. Seeing me, she stood up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Dad? She asked tentatively. I didn't break my stride. I pushed through the heavy double doors and walked out into the sunlight. The air was fresh, entirely clear of the scent of floor wax. It smelled like freedom. I had my name back. I had my dignity back. Now I had one final meeting, a meeting with a young woman who believed she was a victim, and who was about to learn that the only safety net she had left was about to be dismantled. I walked down the broad limestone steps of the courthouse, the weight of the last few weeks lifting from my shoulders with every step. The air was crisp, the kind of clear afternoon that marks the arrival of a new season. I flagged down a taxi, ready to head to the airport and put an ocean between myself and the wreckage of the Sullivan family. But before I could reach the curb, I heard the sound of running footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. That desperate, uneven click of heels on the pavement was a rhythm I knew all too well. It was Madison. Of course it was. Patricia was likely still inside, weeping into her attorney's cheap suit fabric. But Madison was still young enough to believe that tears could mend shattered concrete. She caught up to me, out of breath, her face flushed. She looked nothing like the polished influencer who had mocked me across the table at Le Bernardin. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, her eyes were swollen, and she was wearing a coat that looked like it hadn't seen a dry cleaner in a month. She grabbed my arm, her grip tight and frantic. Please, she gasped. Please don't go. We need to talk. I looked down at her hand on my sleeve. I didn't shake it off. I simply stared at it until she felt the coldness of my gaze and pulled her hand back, retreating into a defensive posture. I have a flight to catch, Madison, I said, my voice flat. Just 5 minutes, she pleaded, tears welling up instantly. You owe me that, don't you? 15 years, Robert. You can't just erase me, Dad. I'm your daughter. I pointed to a stone bench near a dry fountain in the plaza. Sit down, I said. She sat, looking small and pathetic. I remained standing. I wanted the leverage. I wanted her to have to look up at the man she had dismissed for so long. I didn't mean it, she began, the words tumbling out in a rush. The video, the live stream. My mom made me do it. She said it was the only way to get you back. And Gary threatened me. He said if I didn't go along with the real dad thing, he'd leave again. I was scared, Robert. I was just a scared little girl who wanted her dad's approval. You know how I get. I'm stupid sometimes. But I love you. You're the only father I've ever known. She reached out toward me again. Tyler and I broke up, she sniffed. He was a user. You were right about him. And my mom, I'm done with her. I'm moving out. I want to start over. But I can't do it alone. I have nowhere to go. I have debts, Robert. Terrible debts. Please, I know you're angry, but you're not cruel. You wouldn't let your little girl starve. I watched the performance. It was good. Better than the live stream. But the problem with liars is that they assume everyone else has amnesia. She assumed I had forgotten the smirk on her face when she handed me that invitation. She assumed I had forgotten the "just Robert" comment. I reached into my briefcase. I saw her eyes follow the movement, a spark of hope igniting in them. She thought I was reaching for a checkbook. She thought the ATM was back in business. I pulled out a thick blue binder. It wasn't a checkbook. It was a trust document. Do you know what this is? I asked, holding it up. She shook her head, wiping her nose. No. This, I tapped the cover, is the Madison Sullivan Educational and Nuptial Trust. I set this up 10 years ago, after I sold my first company. I put a substantial amount of capital into a high-yield account. I wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to me, you had a safety net. Her eyes went wide and she sat up a bit straighter. A trust fund? How much is in it? I flipped to the financial summary page, pointing to the bottom line. $500,000, I read. I heard the sharp intake of her breath. It was the sound of salvation. I could see the gears turning in her head. $500,000 would wipe out the florist, the caterer, the credit cards, and leave enough for a down payment on a condo. She was already spending it in her mind, imagining the comeback video she would post. Oh my God, Dad, she breathed out, a smile breaking through her tears. I knew it. I knew you loved me. Thank you. Thank you so much. This changes everything. She reached for the binder, but I pulled it back. Sit down, Madison, I said sharply. I am not finished. She froze, her hand hovering in the air. This trust was not a gift, I explained, turning the pages. It was a contract. And like all contracts, it had contingencies. I drafted them myself to ensure that this money would produce a responsible adult, not enable a spoiled child. I flipped to page 12. Clause A, I read from the educational provision. The beneficiary must provide proof of graduation from an accredited 4-year university with a cumulative GPA of 3.0 or higher. I looked at her over the binder. You told us you graduated from NYU 2 years ago? You posted the photos in your cap and gown. We had a celebratory dinner. I gave you a diamond bracelet. She looked down, picking at a loose thread on her coat. Yeah, well, I obviously did. I pulled a letter from the back of the binder, bearing the official letterhead of New York University. This is the response from the registrar's office, I said. I requested a copy of your transcripts to verify the trust conditions. It turns out, Madison, you never graduated. You dropped out your sophomore year to pursue your influencer career full-time. You took the tuition money I sent you and spent it on Botox and followers. The diploma you showed your mother was a forgery. Her face went pale. Robert, I can explain. There is nothing to explain. I cut her off. You stole the tuition. That's fraud. But I was willing to overlook it. I would have waived the educational clause if you had passed the second contingency. I turned the page. Clause B, I said, my voice dropping an octave. The conduct provision. I began to read the legal text aloud. The funds shall be released in full on the day of the beneficiary's wedding, provided that throughout the wedding preparation and ceremony, the current legal guardian and stepfather, Robert Sullivan, is acknowledged as the father of the bride and treated with due respect and honor. Any public humiliation, denial of relationship, or demonstration of bad faith toward the grantor shall result in the immediate revocation of the trust. I snapped the binder shut. You had one job, Madison. You didn't have to be a scholar. You just had to be a decent human being. You just had to extend a fraction of the respect to the man who raised you that you gave to the stranger who walked out on your mother. But you couldn't do it, could you? You had to prove a point. You had to tell the world I was just Robert. You had to erase me from the picture because I didn't fit your aesthetic. Madison was shaking now, not from the cold, but from sheer terror. Dad, please, she begged, dropping to her knees on the pavement. I'm sorry. I'll fix it. We can do another wedding. I'll post a retraction. I'll tell everyone you're the best father in the world. Just give me one more chance. I can't live like this. I have nothing. I looked down at her. I saw the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, but then I saw the woman who had laughed when my house was liquidated. I saw the woman who had stood by while the media swarmed me. I pulled a gold pen from my pocket. It's too late for retractions, Madison. There's a final clause to this trust. If the conditions are unmet by the wedding date, the grantor has absolute discretion to redirect the funds. I placed the binder on the stone bench, flipping to the beneficiary page. I drew a thick line through the name Madison Miller. The scratch of the pen on the paper was loud in the dead air between us. Madison watched in paralysis as I wrote, "In the new recipient, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans." I signed my name at the bottom. "No!" she screamed, lunging for the book. "You can't! That's my money! You can't give it to strangers!" I stood up, holding the binder out of her reach. "It was never your money, Madison. It was mine. And now it's going to men and women who actually understand the meaning of sacrifice. It's going to people who have been broken by life, but still hold on to their honor. People who would never spit on the hand that fed them." I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the signature page, hitting send. "It's done," I said. "My lawyer has the digital copy. The transfer has been initiated. That account is now empty." Madison collapsed onto the concrete. She wasn't crying this time. She was making a sound like a wounded animal, a hollow, absolute wail of total despair. She curled into a ball, clutching her stomach as if she had been physically struck. The reality had finally landed. $500,000. The life raft, the future, the easy way out. All gone, evaporated by her own arrogance. I took one last look at her. "You wanted independence, Madison. You wanted to cut ties with the bank. So congratulations. You're finally free. You're a self-made woman now. Go build a life." I turned and walked toward the taxi that had just pulled up to the curb. "Robert!" she howled behind me. "Dad, please don't leave me here." I opened the car door, pausing to look back one last time. She was a heap of clothes on the pavement, surrounded by a few pigeons pecking at the concrete near the dry fountain. "Goodbye, Madison," I said. I got into the back seat and closed the door. "JFK Airport, driver," I said. "International Terminal." As the taxi pulled away, merging into the heavy city traffic, I didn't look back. I reached into my phone, pulled out the SIM card and snapped it in half, dropping the pieces into the ashtray. I leaned my head against the headrest and closed my eyes, the hum of the engine vibrating beneath me. For the first time in 15 years, the silence wasn't empty. It was full. It was full of peace. It was full of a future. And behind me, in the city, a check for $500,000 was clearing, buying warm beds and hot meals for soldiers who had been forgotten. It was the best investment I had ever made. In the world of finance, 6 months is a lifetime, but in Tuscany, it feels like a single afternoon. The light is different here. It's softer and more forgiving than the harsh, gray glare of Connecticut. It hits the rolling vineyards with a golden warmth that seeps into your bones, making you forget you ever felt cold. I sat on the stone terrace of a farmhouse, one I had purchased using a small fraction of the capital I saved from the trust liquidation. The air smelled of rosemary, dry earth, and the heavy sweet scent of ripening grapes. There was no noise here. No one screaming about credit cards, no one demanding upgrades to their suites, no one asking me to shrink myself so they could look taller. The only sound was the wind rustling through the olive trees and the distant tractor of my neighbor, an old man named Giovanni, who knew nothing of my past and cared only about the quality of my soil. I poured myself a glass of Sangiovese, a deep ruby color harvested from the vines stretching out before me. I took a sip. It tasted of dark cherries and leather, a complex flavor that required patience to appreciate. It tasted like a life that finally belonged entirely to me. I thought about the life I left behind often, but never with longing. I thought about it the way a shipwreck survivor thinks of the ocean, with a healthy respect for its dangers and a profound gratitude for dry land. Arthur Blackwood kept me updated, of course. He sent brief, objective emails once a week, detailing the collapse of the Miller Empire. Gary was currently a resident of the state penitentiary. To avoid a longer sentence for collusion to defraud, he had accepted a plea deal for the assault and burglary charges. 3 years. He finally had the free housing and board he always felt he deserved. I imagined him as the king of his cell block, telling anyone who would listen about the time he almost took down a millionaire, never realizing he was the one who had been played from the very start. Patricia was working the lunch shift at a diner in New Jersey. Arthur had sent a photo captured by an investigator. She looked exhausted. Her roots had gone gray, the expensive dye jobs a thing of the past. She wore an apron and sensible shoes, wiping down a table while a customer gestured aggressively about a cold cup of coffee. It was a harsh, poetic sort of justice. She had spent 15 years treating me like a servant. Now she was serving others for minimum wage. And Madison, my former stepdaughter, the girl who wanted to be famous. She got her wish, in a way. The live stream of her breakdown in the mud went viral, but not the way she intended. She became a meme, the poster child for entitlement. She had tried to rebrand herself as a victim, launching a GoFundMe to rebuild her life, but the internet is a fickle beast. They mocked her, digging up her old posts, flaunting my wealth. 2 months ago, she deleted her social media accounts. The silence she left behind was the most honest thing she had ever produced. I took another sip of my wine, feeling a vibration on the stone table. It was my phone, a new number tied to a local Italian carrier, known only to Arthur and a few local contractors. Or so I thought. I looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown international number with a Connecticut area code. I picked it up. I didn't have to guess who it was. Desperation has a distinct digital fingerprint. "Robert," the message read, "it's Patty. I got this number from your old accountant. Please don't ignore me. I'm sick, Robert. My legs ache from standing all day, and I can't afford the heating bill this month. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But we were married for 15 years. Doesn't that mean anything? I just need $5,000. Just a loan. I'll pay you back. Please, Robert. I'm scared." I stared at the words. 15 years. She used the number like a weapon, a currency that still held value, not understanding she had spent it all long ago. She spent it on the gambling debts, the lies, and the days she sat in silence while her daughter erased me from an invitation. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no urge to rescue. The part of me that had been her husband, the part of me that had been the savior, had died in that empty kitchen in Greenwich. I looked over at the fire pit built into the terrace wall. The fire was crackling, consuming the dry olive wood I had stacked earlier. The flames licked high, hungry and bright. I didn't reply. I didn't block the number. To do either would be to engage, to acknowledge her existence. I stood up and walked over to the fire, the heat hitting my face. I looked at the phone one last time. It was a sleek, expensive piece of machinery, a tool for communication, but in that moment, it was just a shackle, the last wire connecting me to a world of parasites. I tossed it into the center of the fire, a gentle, underhanded pitch. The phone spun through the air, catching the light of the setting sun, before landing dead center in the embers. I watched it sit on the burning logs for a second. Then the plastic began to bubble. The screen turned black, then cracked, smoke curling up around it. Any future messages, any future pleas, any vibrations of manufactured guilt were silenced forever by the heat. I walked back to the table, picked up my wine glass, and went to the edge of the terrace, looking out over the valley. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The church bells in the village down the road began to ring, calling the faithful to evening prayer. I raised my glass to the open air, tipping it toward the west, toward the ocean, toward a cell block where a man in an orange jumpsuit was lying on a cot. "To Gary," I said into the quiet night, my voice steady and strong. "Thank you." I swirled the wine, watching the legs trace down the glass. "You wanted to be the big man. You wanted the suit. You wanted the credit. Well, you got it. You paid for my freedom, Gary. You let me out of the prison I built for myself. So thank you for picking up the tab for the party." I drank the wine. It was the best glass I had ever tasted. I sat back down in my chair, closing my eyes, listening to the crackle and hiss of the fire as it finished its work. The sun disappeared completely, leaving me in the dark, but I wasn't afraid of the darkness anymore. I lit a cigar, the flame illuminating my face for a brief second, revealing a man who was finally, completely alone. And for the first time in my life, being alone didn't mean loneliness. It meant freedom. I took a draw from the cigar, blowing a cloud of smoke into the Italian night. Let them beg, let them cry, let them rot. I have a harvest to prepare for.